No, I just want to welcome everybody to basically the part is how how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to afford it? Um, sorry. Um, Again, my job or our job as an administration is to safeguard, serve, and shape the district. But more importantly, it's really to guard the heart and mind of the district with peace. So again, I know there's going to be, we're going to agree to disagree or agree to agree or disagree, but let's do it peacefully. And let's do it, I don't want to say professionally, let's just do it nice. And so again, let's have that dialogue. Let's have true dialogue and and so we can move this district forward. That's our job. That's why it's called Just for Kids. This is about kids. It's not about the adults, it's about kids. So with that, I'll take it. Go ahead, Mr. Carr.
Thanks. So Laura, if you want to go ahead and click on start tonight is, beyond just the work that we're doing together, just giving you all a quick recap of where we were last week. In addition to our tour at Canutillo Elementary and a chance to see some of the Lone Star facility for ourselves, we got a good overview from Mr. Ramos about fine arts facility needs throughout the district. And after listening to that, our colleague David Peterson at ADM gave us an overview of what I called the executive summary of some of the recommendations. If you click on to the next slide, or actually one more. So as a reminder, we talked about work in various categories. This is the high level look at those categories that would affect all of your existing schools. But in addition, on the next slide, we talked about these opportunities as future needs. And I think some of the dialogue that we got into is a real interest in understanding more of the detail behind what's being presented here as an executive summary. If you go on one more slide, what you have in your binders and what some of the initial information conveyed was that, as much as 127 million could be spent on the facility upgrades, which within a potential bond amount of 187.5 million, that leaves about 60.5 million for future needs. And really on the next slide, what we were showing last week, which was different from what was in the binder that some folks picked up on, was approaching those facility upgrades differently in terms of recommending the highest level of that work to be done and giving ourselves more runway for addressing some of these other future opportunities still within that same cap. What we're anticipating is that we will be continuing that conversation next Tuesday when we meet on the 29th. But we're adding to our knowledge base tonight by sharing with you all information from the financial advisor from Estrada Hinojosa, who works with Canutillo. He's going to give some overview of really helping to give some context for this 187.5 number, what that means, as well as from the district's legal counsel from Norton Rose Fulbright. They play a role in this too because they help to define what language goes into a bond. And I know there's been a number of questions about the board's role in this process. And so these are our opportunities tonight to listen to both Rudy Mejia and Matt Lee, who will share some information with us and then be available to us for questions. I think it'll work well, if you all don't mind, if we can continue to use our chat window where we all put our names in to write down some questions as we go along. You also, in Zoom, you have the opportunity, you can raise your hand, but just in case we miss that visually, the chat will be a great way to record questions as they come up. And then we'll either try to answer those in the moment or we'll get to the end of Rudy's portion or Matt's portion and come back and start to answer those questions that get entered into the chat window. So with that, I think, Laura, you can move on to the next slide, and Rudy will take it away from here.
Was Rudy? I know Rudy was having some technical. Is he on now?
I don't see his name yet in the list of attendees.
If he's not, I'm happy to move on to my portion in the meantime. Up to you guys.
Liza and Martha, would you like to do that? Do you want to skip to Matt and we'll come back to the finance?
I know you were on the phone with Rudy. I think she's trying.
He said that the link is not letting him in. So go ahead.
Ms. Piekarski, is he entering the password?
I didn't think there was a password.
I'll resend him the link as well.
Just go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Matt.
Okay, sure. So I'm Matt Lee with Norton Rose Fulbright, the district's bond counsel. We've looked at, Carr just showed us some of the projects that the
Mr. Matt,
district's
can
been.
you kind of give what a bond counsel does for a district, what your role is?
Sure.
Just a little tidbit. Thank you.
Sure. So our role as bond counsel is in our firm specifically, anything bond related. If the school district wants to go out and, issue bonds, it could take several different forms, but basically if they want to issue a bond to finance certain projects, new schools, upgrades to existing facilities and whatnot, we would represent the school district in the issuance of those bonds. Every bond in the state of Texas has to be reviewed and approved by the Attorney General of the state of Texas. So we would help the district through that process. But before a district is authorized to issue bonds, the voters, generally, the voters must authorize the school district at a bond election. And so our firm, as part of our full services to the district, we would assist the district and guide it through the bond election process. So if we're looking at a November election, we would assist the district with calling that election. Here, the deadline would be around August 16th, 2021. We would help the district with, communicating with its voters. We would help the district with canvassing the results of that election. And then once authorized by the voters at the election, we would assist the district with issuing those bonds that have been authorized. And then so on. So anything bond related after, post issuance of the bonds, which could include certain disclosure requirements with the SEC or IRS audits, anything like that, our firm would be able to assist with that. So that's a real high level overview of what a bond counsel can do and what we will do for the district. So here we're talking about an anticipated bond election for November 2021, and we're looking at these projects. And so first you have to take a look at each of the project, make sure it's an eligible project. The projects that are listed in this PowerPoint earlier that Carr showed us on the PowerPoint, these all are eligible projects that a school district can submit to the voters in a ballot or a proposition to vote on. And so, the next question is, once we fine tune those projects, how will those projects be submitted to the voters? And, there's multiple aspects that need to be looked at. One is transparency to the voters, but also, making sure that the district is asking the right questions. So we have plenty of experience. We represent many school districts across the state. I believe this November alone, we're already looking at, 10 school districts have already committed to calling a November election. So we're already well within this process. So once we fine tune this project list, we'll work with the district on, to the extent any of the projects need to fall under a separate proposition. There's new legislation that requires certain projects be listed separately. So we'll work with the district on that. And any other items related to that ballot that'll go to the voters to give the voters the most transparency on what they're voting on and make sure it's all in line with, the most recent legislative changes that took effect September of 2019. So that the district's following everything in accordance with state law.
Matt, can you talk a little bit about one of the items that is likely to be included in the recommendation, which is related to the maintenance tax notes that included some of the technology equipment that has been purchased?
Okay. So when Rudy gives his presentation, we'll talk about the two buckets of funding generally that a school district has at its option. So the overall tax rate is made up of an M&O tax rate and then a debt service tax rate. The maintenance tax notes that were issued last year in 2020 to purchase some certain technology equipment, which I believe a lot of it might have been iPads and things like that. Those maintenance tax notes are secured by the M&O side of the overall tax rate. And so school districts have always had the authorization and the ability to refund that maintenance tax debt from the M&O side over to the INS side, interest and sinking fund side. And so to do so, that has to go to the voters for their approval. So that'll be required to be submitted under a separate proposition. So it looks like most, if not all, of the current projects that we'll be discussing, it looks like they should fall under the general proposition, which is acquiring, improving, upgrading, equipping, et cetera, school buildings. But there'll have to be a separate proposition that specifically says the school district is asking the voters to authorize it to move this M&O debt, the maintenance tax notes, over to the INS side. The board can't just do that on its own. That has to go to the voters for approval. So that's one of the items that you'll see listed separately in here, and that'll be required to be under a separate proposition.
So if there is a bond election this November, all of you who are voters, when you go to the ballot, there's going to be two items potentially that you would be voting on. One of which is what we would typically call the bond. But then there's a second part that requires a separate vote that would be described in the language as pertaining to this maintenance tax note. That would be reimbursed. Is reimbursed the right word for that?
Probably refinance. It's
Refinance.
technically, I guess, a refinancing of current outstanding debt.
Okay.
Or restructuring, yeah.
Another question, Matt, that has come up a number of times already in our committee relates to oversight of a bond election, of the work that goes into the bond. So there's been two questions, I think, that pertain to that. And I want to start with the easier one, which is if Canutillo ISD anticipates hiring a bond manager, someone who will work for them as a third party to oversee the projects that are in the bond and make sure that they are delivered according to what the bond is described, that they're on a schedule and in budget. Can that bond manager be hired with funds from the bond itself?
So that's actually one of the things I have on my to-do list to confirm. We can, I believe there is a way to do that. We'll have to look at the facts and make sure that we're doing it appropriately. I believe our tax attorneys will want to take a look at that to make sure, because as long as it's something that could be capitalized to a project, then it could be permissible. So we'll just want to make sure that we have the right facts here. That could be an internal employee versus an external consultant. So, certain things like that, I know our tax attorneys will want to look at to make sure that if that is the intent, that we're following that to the letter of the law.
And the second question that I think is related to this is about what the school board's role is in calling the election and in guiding the delivery of the projects that are described in the election.
Okay.
So one way of asking that as a question is, when a bond election is presented to the voters, how specific can the language be about what projects are in a bond versus really general language that's just, this is a bond for schoolwork?
Right. And that's up to the school board on how transparent that the bond proposition will read. Under state law, it could be very general. It could just say acquiring, renovating, improving, upgrading, equipping, a bunch of verbs, all that, school facilities or land or buses. And it could be as general as that. And prior to the legislative change in September of 2019, that's all that was required of a school board to include in the proposition. The board has always had the discretion to be more specific or to break it out into separate propositions. Maybe the board or maybe the citizens knew that one specific project might have been a hot button item and didn't want that one project to affect the overall projects of the district. So boards have always had the discretion to break up the proposition or the projects into multiple propositions, or just have one very general proposition. So what we've seen some boards do is they leave the language very broad, which is permissible under state law, but then include language that says, the proposition we talked about, the broad language, comma, including, and then you specifically identify certain projects. So here I know there's contemplated maybe a new elementary school, a new middle school. So you would specifically identify those in that proposition language. And so that way the voters can see those are the projects that, that they'd be voting on. And the school board would have to follow those specifically enumerated projects. And to the extent any of those projects came in under budget, there's excess funds, those surplus funds would kind of fall back to that general broad language, and the board would have discretion to do other general purpose type items at the, across the school district's facilities.
One of the questions that came up in our chat, and I appreciate Martha's already resolved it, but just so that everyone hears it in case you don't have your chat window up, one of our committee members asked, would the restructuring of the debt that's associated with those maintenance tax notes, does that reduce the amount of money overall? And to be clear about that, as Martha mentioned, right now we're anticipating that would be done within the 187.5. So that might suggest, let's say that that refinancing part is 10 million. I'm just going to use that as a number. That's close to, I think, what we've seen in some of our presentation materials. What that would suggest is that you as a voter may see a proposition that's asking for permission for up to 1,777.5 for school facilities that may include a future elementary school, that would include however that language is presented. Then in the second proposition, it would say, is there approval for 10 million to be used for the refinance of payment for maintenance tax notes? So in other words, the two propositions together are likely to add up to that total amount but at the ballot, you wouldn't see language that explains this is the total amount of A plus B. Does that make sense to everyone? And I think I'm saying that correctly, Matt, isn't that right?
That's right.
So if the language is not specific in terms of A plus B, how accountable is the school board, given, Matt, what you just said in terms of if the proposal, whether it's, in one as general or broken up into multiple, that the more specific it is, the more the board is held accountable to those specific things. Do we need to keep in mind that language as we're drafting this proposal to go to the board, in terms of what, if there is something specific that we want to make sure is addressed and the board is held accountable to, that it is in that language and or that it is voted on as a separate proposition?
So not considering the maintenance tax note piece, because that's going to be very specific on how that's worded. But for the general proposition piece, which looking at the projects now, it looks like all of the remaining projects will fall under one general proposition. So the proposition will read, the 187.5 less the maintenance tax note amount of, let's just call it 10. So the proposition will read, do the voters authorize the school board to issue an amount up to 177.5 or whatever the math is, to, and then we've got our proposition language, comma, and then the specific projects that, especially the big ones that we want to make sure that the board is focusing on, the new elementary school, the new middle school, a lot of these maintenance items like new roofs, things like that. So if that's something that's, very important to, the citizens and the board, we would definitely include that type of specific language inside that bond proposition. And to the extent that that the school board wants to carve out, I can't think of a reason now. So in the past, I'll say it this way. In the past, before school districts, boards were required to separate out propositions, which was pre-September 2019. School districts building these massive football stadiums or natatoriums or things like that weren't really popular. School boards didn't want those projects to affect the overall bond, the ability of it to pass. And so if they knew going into the bond election that maybe one of those projects would taint the overall bond election, they would separate that out. And so we've seen, historically, I think, before the legislative change back in 2017-18, we saw quite a few school districts put up these, large, especially rural school districts would put up these large football stadiums because they knew those probably had a lesser likelihood of passing. And so you'd see a complete flip in the passer rating. You'd see under the general, your typical items, building schools or upgrading schools, those would have a pretty favorable voter turnout passer rating. Whereas some of these other items that they kind of knew going into the bond would have trouble, those didn't do as well. But here it looks like most of the items are, upgrading, improving, and then new campuses. So unless there's any one of those that, maybe something political within the community, maybe that would be separated out. But as of right now, it looks like all those, it'd be our recommendation to put all those under one proposition and then be as specific as we need to within that proposition.
And so another question from our committee that I think is spot on with what you just said, Matt. How can this committee, if they are interested in knowing how to hold the board accountable, how to, what are their options for having the board commit to make the proposition language be completely transparent, be completely clear as to what it is that this bond is meant to do? How can the committee help see that part move forward.
So I think the projects that we have listed in this PowerPoint, it's a pretty executive summary, right? Do we, and we probably have more detail behind all that. But I do think the executive summary specifically identifies a new elementary school, right? A new middle school, your typical roofing replacement, HVAC, things like that. So that proposition language would read standard broad language, comma, including a new middle school, elementary school, upgrades to existing school facilities, which would pick up all the roofing, HVAC, those types of things. And so that can be quite lengthy. And we have plenty of examples of where school districts have done that to be completely transparent to the voters. And those projects would have to be a priority of the board, assuming that the bonds are authorized at the election. Once authorized, the school board will then proceed to issue those bonds over time, I believe, and they would have to identify those projects within each of those, or address those projects first with the proceeds of those bonds that are issued as they issue the bonds.
Alexis just asked a great question, and I can answer this one. Matt and I are talking about this based on the information we presented to you all as an idea of what projects could move forward, but there's not a commitment that those are the projects. So that's what we'll come back to spend more time talking about next week. And we want to have further discussion on that. But for the sake of this discussion, let's assume that there's going to be a recommendation that comes from our committee that is a project X or a project Y. Once we know that project X is really important to this committee, that's a part of how we want to be sure it's conveyed to the board. We want that language to be really clear. And I think, Matt, one of the things I would find this helpful, and so I think on behalf of the committee might be helpful, if you could share one of those examples of the language for a proposition that might be lengthy, but does go into more clarity about what a district has in mind to do in a bond.
Sure.
I think it would be useful for us to see an example of something like that.
Okay.
Do y'all, y'all can give me a thumbs up. Those of you who have your cameras on, if you agree, just seeing an example of that language, I think it would be useful for us. I think if it's all right with you all, I apologize if you can hear my dogs behind me. There's someone driving by, and so that's what happens with Zoom calls. But I know Rudy is here, Rudy Mejia, and I think it'd be great for us to segue to him and get some more of the financial discussion going. That might lead to more questions that we want to come back and ask of Matt, so he's still a part of the call. But I think if it's all right, I'd like to turn the floor over to Rudy, and we'll actually go back to our shared screen so that he can walk through some information with us about the numbers.
Well, thanks a lot, Carr. Definitely appreciate that introduction, and thanks, Matt, for the clarity that you provided on the legality of having a bond election. And before I start, I want to thank the committee and the community members that are on the call, because I think it's important for the community to understand where their taxpayer dollars are going and how they're being spent. So without further ado, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So as Matt alluded to earlier, the tax rate is comprised of basically two buckets, right? One bucket is called your maintenance and operations, your M&O tax rate. And then the other bucket is your INS tax rate, your interest and sinking fund. The difference between the two are maintenance and operation funds are used for teacher salaries, upkeep of existing buildings, sports funding, things of that nature, right? The more day-to-day operations of a school district. Your INS side is used for construction projects, new construction projects, building high schools, elementary schools, resurfacing tracks. That side is specifically levied to pay down debt, right? The bond debt. And so I want to say since 2014, maybe 2013, the Canutillo ISD school district's INS tax rate has been 36 cents. Currently, the M&O side is $1.03. So the $1.03, let's talk about the M&O side first, because there's going to be some legislative changes coming up next year that's going to affect the overall tax rate, right? So due to the 2019 legislature, the state decided to start compressing maintenance and operations tax rates. And so right now we're at $1.03, but just a year or so ago, we were at $1.17, right? So if you compare your tax rate from just 2 years ago, you're currently down 13 to 14 cents on the M&O side. When Ms. Pekarsky sets her tax rate in September, the M&O is going to be 98 cents, right, due to the state compression. And so you may be asking, well, how is the school district able to operate with a lower tax rate collection on the M&O side? And that is because the state has come in and agreed to make up that revenue difference, right? So they're passing the savings onto the local taxpayers, and the state is taking on more of the overall burden on the M&O side. Where your school district specific has the most influence on your tax rate is the INS side. The INS side, again, is levied in order to pay down debt. And what we are looking at as a collective is what is the appropriate tax rate on the INS side to support a $187.5 million bond election. Right now, we're estimating that to be a 5-cent INS tax rate increase, right? So for an additional 5 pennies on the INS side, there should be enough monies generated to cover the $187 million debt financing. So if you don't mind, next slide, please. So here's how this all kind of breaks down. So at the end of the day, when a taxpayer is looking at their tax bill, they see that $1.39 tax rate, right? That they don't, the El Paso County doesn't break it out between the M&O and the INS. What the taxpayers see is $1.39. So along with staff and your consultants, the district has found a solution to achieve $187.5 million bond election with, from a taxpayer perspective, would be no increase on their total tax bill, right? So your tax rate for 2022, 2023 will be $1.39. Let's go to the next slide, please. I want to talk about how they're able to accomplish this with the way it works on paper, right? So right now we're at, if you look at that column or that debt service column that's highlighted in yellow, we're currently at 36 cents, right? In 2021, we're at 36 cents. On the M&O side, we're at $1.03. If in 2022, the state is going to lower our M&O side down 5 pennies to 98 cents. If we raise our tax rate on the INS side to 41 pennies, as a taxpayer, it's a net, it's a wash, right? So there's no increase in your overall tax rate. However, there will be an increase on the INS portion of your overall tax rate. But at the end of the day, you see the taxpayer sees that the overall tax rate is maintained at $1.39. And really that should be the word that we use of choice, right? Maintaining our current level of tax rates. So, however, still increasing the infrastructure that the district has. So is there another slide after this one? This kind of goes over how it impacts your average household. You know, really your overall tax rate should stay the same, right? So if property values continue to rise as they have been, the increase in your overall tax bill is due to the increase in your overall property values, right? The school district intends to tax you no more than the existing overall tax rate. And that this slide right here kind of highlights how that would impact your yearly bill. Next slide, please.
That's it for this section.
Okay, perfect. So with that, I also want to add that the consultants, your staff, the superintendent is very cognizant of how these additional projects affect the taxpayers, right? And to answer some of the questions on how do we keep the board accountable, you know, this is the type of information, and we will go into additional detail on how we specifically pay for all these bonds. But at the end of the day, my job as the district's financial advisor is to figure out how to minimize the impact on the taxpayer. And so we're coming up with some really creative ways to meet the goal of the community and at the same time keeping that cost at the lowest possible dollar. And with that, you know, I'd love to entertain any questions finance related. Thank you.
Rudy,
Yes.
in the very beginning, Matt went into a little bit about what the bond council does. Can you possibly tell the community what the financial advisor, what exactly does that mean?
The financial advisor figures out innovative ways to meet a district's financing goals, right? So basically, when we bring a bond to market, we're creating, in essence, the IPO market for a bond offering, right? And so we have one bucket that we work out of, and that's the INS side, right? So we need to make sure that the tax levy is appropriate to meet the debt service requirement on the bonds. And so we work with Martha and Dr. Galavis in setting tax rates, ensuring that there's enough revenue coming in to support a bond deal, and coming up with a whole, we call it a plan of finance. And so we create that plan to help minimize the cost to the taxpayers.
So Rudy, we have two questions already from our committee members.
Sure
The
thing.
first one is, can you describe what happens if for some reason the property tax values were to drop?
Sure. So if property tax values drop, you know, we plan for the worst and hope for the best. And so let me kind of re-say that. Together with staff, we come up with these plans, and we take very conservative approaches into estimating and forecasting what our TAV is going to be, what our tax rate collection is going to be, and then come up with a model to solve the problem, right? We stress test that model, and that includes property values not increasing, right? Or maybe property values decreasing. That also includes, you know, lawsuits. It includes property owners or businesses petitioning their tax levy to the county, right? And believe it or not, guys, the school district fights that battle every year, right? So our collection rates, though, you know, the citizens are paying their share and you know, they're paying their tax bills, businesses, local businesses are petitioning their tax bills and sometimes winning. And so that means less revenue to the district. So when we build our models out, we try to be conservative, we stress test it. And the last thing we want to do is underestimate a tax rate collections, and then have to increase the INS tax rate additionally to make up that gap, right? Because if we tell you that we have to increase the tax rate 5 pennies, that should be the max that it takes. That is, you know, that is, we definitely don't want to go above what we are estimating it to be. So we do build in some stress tests to counter a TAV decrease.
So what you're saying is that 187.5 is kind of a sweet spot in terms of what could happen with the property values?
What I'm saying is at our current property value levels,
Mhm,
assuming some very conservative growth assumptions,
mhm.
we can finance 187 million in new bond projects comfortably, where even if property values decrease a little bit, the district would still have enough funds to make those debt service payments.
Okay.
So Rudy, I'm sorry, Cart. Rudy, do you want to say anything about the rates, the current rate market?
Yeah, thank you for that, Martha. Just about a year and a half ago, Canutillo ISD received a bond rating increase from Moody's, which is the premier credit rating agency here in the U.S. Our underlying credit rating of AA3, okay, is, if I could equate that to a, you and I, my credit score and your credit score, let's just say it's around a 750 to 800 credit score, right? So just like you and I, when we go apply for a mortgage, the stronger your credit rating is, the lower the interest rate is going to be for a new house, right? So right now, our credit rating as a district is AA3 and is very strong in the market. So why is this important? It's important because when we go out and sell bonds, we're leveraging our credit rating, and the investors will look at that, and that is what is the determining factor of our overall interest rate, or it's at least one of the levers that dictates our interest rate. And so, we're discussing the bond election today, but we have been working on improving the district's finances for at least 8 years now in preparation of a future bond election. And so, and Ms. Pekarsky can tell you, a little better than I can, but the district has received awards for transparency, for financial practices from the state, from TEA, and it's due to the conservative approach that we take on an overall basis, with all types of financings. Over the past 5 years alone, we've probably saved close to $8 million by implementing refundings, by trying to decrease the interest rates on our bonds. And so that has allowed for the district to even consider a bond program this large, right? Building capacity over the past 8 years, taking advantage of a low interest rate environment. And by the way, we're still in a very, very low interest rate environment. If you and I went out and refinanced our mortgage today, it'd probably be under 3%, right? And so same deal with bonds. We're looking at, today we priced a deal for Fort Worth Independent School District, who's in the market again tomorrow as well, but we're looking at interest rates at 2%. So, there's no other financing mechanism available to a district where they're going to find a lower interest rate than that. So your cost of debt is extremely low right now. But that's a good question, Martha, and I think it's something to be proud about as a community. You have a staff that's working on behalf of the taxpayers and ensuring that your costs are as low as possible.
Rudy, I'd like to ask another question on behalf of the committee. And
Sure
I think
thing.
this is a great question, actually. When you think about our property values, let's say they go the other way. Let's say that property values increase more. It's a healthier climate from that point of view in terms of property values. How would that impact the value of the bond? Is the bond's dollar amount tied to the change in property values, or is it a fixed amount, a fixed dollar amount that's irrespective of what might happen to our property valuation?
That's a good question, Carr, and it's the latter. So their property values will not impact the construction costs of the elementary school or whatnot. But what's going to drive that is, the cost of lumber, the cost of steel, things of that nature, commodities kind of going up in price overnight, right? And The district is building in some type of cushion to account for that type of increase. Here's the best case scenario, right? Let's say, I think this year property values grew almost 10% in Canutillo, right? Let's say they go up 20% next year, and then another 15% in the following year, right? It could, excuse me one second, I think I have a fire truck passing by. It could happen where property values go so high that the opportunity to lower the INS tax rate presents itself and still support $187.5 million bond election. And if you guys recall, in 2012 or 2013, the last time the district had a bond election, we went out and told voters that we were going to have to raise the INS tax rate to, I believe it was 42 or 43 cents. And I just told you that we've been at 36 cents since 2014. So we were able to issue all of those bonds, take advantage of refundings and whatnot, and not have to raise the tax rate. That was a completely different type of bond election, but it was partly due to a rapid increase in property values and the low interest rate environment that we were in, where the district didn't have to raise that INS tax rate. So it could, I'm not saying it will happen, it could happen where, unforeseen to me or any of the other consultants, property values go up 25% next year. And I mean, at that point, there's no need to increase or whatnot. But all we can really do is plan based on the information that we have today. Today, we know where our property values are. We know what our debt profile looks like, and we know what it can handle, right? So when we stress it as much as possible, 5 pennies seems to be that sweet spot, to use one of your words, Carr, to solve the 187 million bond election.
Is another way of saying that if this committee or the community at large really wanted to do $200 million worth of work or $225 million worth of work, that would necessitate increasing the overall tax rate, because we couldn't afford to take on that new debt within the tax rate that we currently have. We'd have to increase the overall tax rate. Is that a fair thing to say?
So I think that's a valid question, Carr, and it's a good one. And let me try to help the public understand how this works a little better, right? So the school district, the board, once they finalize their needs, in this case, elementary schools or whatnot, as you were describing earlier, that is the driving factor of how much a school district can borrow, right, of debt. And then the next factor is timing, right? How soon do we need this elementary school to be up and operational, right? If we have 5 to 7 years to satisfy the need, then we can extend the debt or the bond program out a little bit, right? So I want to be hesitant in saying that our debt portfolio cannot handle 200 million or 225 million, because it can, given certain factors, right? Time, property values, and several other things. But with the information that we have today, if the district did want to go up to 225 million, we definitely need to adjust assumptions, and maybe 5 pennies can get us there. It just depends on some other factors like timing and things like that.
Matt, how would you approach this from a legal language point of view?
So just to make sure we're on the same page, and I don't think this was asked, but I can kind of sense it in the questions. The voters are voting on a par amount. They're not voting on a tax rate, right? I mean, we don't know what that tax rate's going to be. There's too many factors. So you're voting on the 187.5 or whatever the number is. But I just want to make clear, I sat through a couple citizens committee meetings in the past 2 weeks where similar questions came up. And so I just want to make sure we're all clear that just because the voters authorized the bonds does not mean they're issued, right? So, you know, if the voters vote to approve the bonds in November, until those bonds are issued, the district does not have any authority to levy an INS tax rate to pay for debt that's not issued, right? So there are some school districts out there that have bonding capacity currently for, let's just say, 100 million, but they're going out for a $500 million bond election because they plan on, you know, over time issuing that debt over a 10-year plan of finance, right? So they're going to continue to monitor property values and some of those other factors, interest rates, all that kind of stuff. And so as their bonding capacity increases, if those TAV values, the property values continue to increase, then their bonding capacity increases and then they're able to issue those bonds. But your financial advisor, Rudy, and his team, they're not going to advise you guys on doing more than what you're, like he said, they're taking a conservative approach. They're not going to recommend something that you don't have the capacity to handle. So, that's something that we'll monitor, but just because it's voted on by the voters doesn't mean it's issued and authorized. And so until it's issued and authorized, then it'll be, then the district would be authorized to levy a tax rate, an INS tax rate sufficient to pay that debt service.
Relevant for all of you on the committee to understand the place that Dr. Peterson and Michelle and I come into this is that when we're looking at projects that Canutillo wants to do, maintenance work at the existing schools, or the possibility of these new facilities, we're trying to identify what we anticipate those are going to cost, the price of lumber, as Rudy mentioned, to determine how much money the district ought to borrow to accomplish these things. And we've seen instances where districts, like Matt was referring to, they might have authorization for some amount of work, but they don't get around to doing that construction work for several years. And by the time they want to start to take that work on, inflation has caused the price of lumber, so to speak, or the price of construction more generally, to increase. So there's a little bit of a timing issue from a facilities point of view that once it's agreed upon that we want to try to do this work, you'd want to move forward with that work in a timely manner and not let it wait too long, because that work will start to cost you more. As it pertains to that, one of our committee members just asked about last minute change orders. And that's exactly part of how the bond amount as a whole is put together, so that it's not down to the penny in terms of exactly what construction is going to cost, but you've got some financial cushion there for contingency, for some unknowns, for any of those things that you want to try to take into account, an unknown that might be inflation as well. So that comes into play, and that's a lot of the work that Dr. Peterson has done already, along with Bruno, to try to understand exactly what these figures are that we're bringing to you all for consideration and evaluation. What other questions do you all have for either Rudy or Matt that you'd like to try to answer today while we have them here for our conversation together? One thing worth bringing up is something that Matt mentioned earlier. I'd like to circle back and be sure this is clear for you all. As it's identified, and there's consensus around the idea of what we'd want to accomplish in a bond. We move to the next step of being sure that there's language that is presented to the board that we get the board to agree to. We want the board to feel comfortable with in terms of what the bond is going to do. Project X, Project Y, and Project Z. Let's just call it that. If the bond passes and projects X, Y, and Z are accomplished, but it doesn't take the entire bond amount to do those, that's where you may have a situation where you have bond savings. And those savings come into play to allow the district to finish other projects or get some other work done beyond project X, Y, and Z. And so I think that's come up in the past with this idea of what bond savings are and how they work. The intent for that is that once the work that was identified in the bond has been accomplished, if there's any monies left, what might those monies be spent on? So I hope that's clear.
Car,
Yes.
Rudy just texted me that he has another meeting that he needs to jump off.
Okay.
So we'll say last call for any questions for our financial advisor.
If any committee member thinks of a question later, please share it with Martha, and I can definitely help answer it. I think you guys are doing a great job having these meetings and discussing this, and really transparency is everything. And so let me know. But you have a great team here working on behalf of the district. So thank you all for your time tonight.
Thank you for joining us, Rudy.
Thank you, Rudy.
And I think that is key. We still have the opportunity to ask more questions and bring back more information to you all from him or from Matt beyond just what we're talking about right now. One of our committee members asked a general question for all of us. So when and how will we pick the projects to present to the board? And that's our next step on that, is to revisit that conversation next Tuesday evening. Next Tuesday, we're going to meet in person again. We're going to be at Canutillo Middle School. The agenda, as we see it for that meeting, is with the context that we have from tonight and understanding what this 187.5 entails, if that's the target we're hitting. What is the work that was described in that executive summary? What's the data behind the executive summary? What does that look like compared to the data that was given to you all already in your binders? How do we make that connection between them? So that is really the ultimate goal for next Tuesday, is to feel better about where we're arriving in terms of a sense of consensus within our committee. The next step after that would be for us to have a workshop with the Board of Trustees early in the month of July. I'm not sure if that date has been set, but what we're looking at is being able to give a report back to the school board about the work that we have all done together as a committee. We would not be making a recommendation to them that night, but we want to share the direction that we're headed and give the board a chance to weigh in and give their feedback and start to get their buy-in on the work that we're doing. I wouldn't want us to be making a recommendation to them if there is something that the board feels strongly about that they think should be taken into consideration. Let's hear that from them before our work gets done. So next week we'd be working together to get the the idea of what we think a recommendation might be. We share that idea with the board, let them weigh in, and then we'll be meeting with you all again after that in the month of July. So you all can get a sense of what the board's take is before we finalize our work in a recommendation that has a bow on it, so to speak, to present formally from you all, from our spokespeople from this committee, to the Board of Trustees at the very end of July or the beginning of August. If we agree to a recommendation for a school bond this November, the board would have to call that bond no later than August 16th. That's the deadline that's set by the law, so to speak, in terms of when a bond would have to be called. So that's our latest date for when the recommendation would come from this committee, the language that we would want to see, all of that sort of information to go to our school board for them to then take action to agree to call for a bond election. And right now what we're targeting is that would take place right at the very end of July or early in the month of August. I'm reading a couple more questions that have come through in the chat. One is for Matt. You mentioned canvassing. How can you help support transparency in communicating all of this information to the community?
So when I mentioned canvassing earlier, that was canvassing the results of the election. So I believe the election date, what does that fall on this year? November 1st?
I think it's the 1st, yeah.
November 2nd, yes. So November 2nd would be election day. And then the Board of Trustees will have, I think, 11 or 12 days after that date to canvass the results of the election. So that's what I meant by canvassing. But between the date that the bond election is called, which the deadline for that is August 16th, up until the bond election on November 2nd, our firm is happy to participate in communications with the citizens that the district staff or whoever is putting on. We review brochures or anything that goes out. We take a look at that to make sure that it's they're not advocacy. They can't advocate one way or the other for our bonds. They can only present facts to the voters. So we make sure that all that is correct. And of course, whatever is in the bond election order, which has to be, as of August 16th, that is what it is. And so beyond that, any publication that goes out, we review that and make sure that there's nothing in those communications that are beyond what is inside that bond election order. There's also some new statutory language that is kind of, frankly, frustrating. So here we're not anticipating a tax rate increase, but the new legislation requires you to put in this is a property tax increase. And so we work with school districts on getting around that language and communicating to the voters within the confines of the law that, it's not a property tax increase. So we're definitely involved to the extent the district, wants us to be, and the working group wants us to be. We're happy to take a look at all the communications that go out to the voters.
The next question that came through is a more general one, I think, for us to weigh in on, and that's the idea of how do we continue to gain more community feedback as this recommendation takes shape. And what I would say is that's why you all have such an important role on this committee. We really want you all to be talking with your neighbors, be talking with other parents at schools to see what they think about the work we're doing. The district's already trying to put information out via the district's website or on Facebook about the ongoing work of our committee. But I don't know that we have specific plans for a town hall because I think the town hall could be confusing if we don't have a recommendation in place. We wouldn't want to have a town hall until we're telling them this is the recommendation. This is what we're looking to do. We want you all are our sounding board for these ideas. Your discussion is so valuable to this. And you are in your own way acting as a representative for the larger committee. I mean, larger community, excuse me. You're the committee representing the community. So you are totally empowered and encouraged to be talking about these ideas with everyone else in Canutillo who has an interest in the schools and wants to see the district move forward and be successful. Get their thoughts and feedback on what we've been talking about, and bring that to the conversation next week and in the month of July. That's really what our hope is for you all in terms of the part that you're playing. I know so far this is a little bit shorter meeting from some of the other conversations we've had. But I think that, without the tour, we were hoping that we wouldn't take quite as much of your time tonight. I think that I don't know that I have anything else specific to say or add. Martha or Liza, is there anything else that you want to share?
I think just a test. Weren't we going to test them on everything that's been covered?
A pop quiz.
Y'all are the school district, so y'all are the teachers. That would be entirely up to you.
Hi, this is Daisy Cisneros. So you guys having said that about a test, because I kind of jumped in the meeting a little bit later. And somebody probably already asked this question, go ahead and ask it. So I know you guys are talking a lot about transparency, and I think that's one of the main concerns for the community. I know somebody did ask about how we can help hold the board accountable of, the money being spent, or let's say that the bond does pass, it's approved, and, there's certain things obviously there that need to be completed or done, projects, whatever that may be. How can we make sure that they are spending those monies per se in those projects, and it is going to the reason why they asked for a bond in the first, or requested a bond or applied for it, whatever that language is. But how can we make sure that it is being spent where it's supposed to, and can we do that as a community?
And Carl, I'm happy to reiterate what we said earlier. So I'm Matt Lee, with the Northern Fulbright, the district's bond counsel, and so we'll help the board and the district in crafting that proposition language that'll go to the voters. Under state law, the district or the board is, has the discretion to draft that language as broadly as possible, but they also have the discretion to put in specific projects. And so our advice to school boards and school districts is draft it generally, and then you include the specific items after that general language. And so those projects would have to be identified and addressed first as bonds are issued, and the proceeds from those bonds are used for those projects. And then to the extent that, a project comes in under budget and there's extra proceeds, the district or the board would have the discretion to use those surplus funds only on those, general type purposes within the district.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'd like to respond to another question that's in the chat. The idea of a bond oversight committee, establishing one, and what's the role of a typical bond oversight committee once an election has taken place. So while there's no legal requirements that stipulate exactly what a committee like that does, what they often do is they serve in a capacity that's very similar to the one that you all have served in thus far, to get reports on the work that's being done, get a sense of the progress of the bond, projects that are underway, projects that are in the queue to come up, and weigh in and just be sure to kind of make sure things are progressing as you might expect in terms of meeting what's in the bond. So that's really the idea of what that bond oversight committee's role would be. And I know there's another comment here, and this will be a good segue for us next week, is just being sure that the balance is right in terms of the facility assessment, how much work needs to be done on our existing facilities, and balancing that with the future needs. So I think that's a great comment for us to leave our conversation on tonight. I think what I'd like to do now is just, I know Rudy already left, but let's all say thanks to Matt for his input tonight. We'll be sharing out, I know this was recorded, so I think this presentation will be available for us if we need it, to go back and re-listen to any of the discussion. But let's plan to see each other next Tuesday, same time, Canutillo Middle School, and we'll continue the conversation from there.